Why is it physically impossible to legally convict a criminal in one 50-mile stretch of America, yet perfectly normal for an entire town to spend 60 years quietly burning to death underground? Welcome to 71 Dumbest Geographical Anomalies, where we are exposing the wildest map blunders ever made, like the time-drunk surveyors carved a border straight through people's kitchens, alongside absurd towns that crowned their own kings and rivers that literally flowed backward for hours. We are proving which insane stories are 100% real history and which are just cartographic lies, like the fact that Alaska is somehow the easternmost state. So hit that subscribe button before we reveal the truth. 1. Somewhere in the Idaho slice of Yellowstone sits a 50-square-mile zone, where the Constitution accidentally lets a person commit a felony and stroll away whistling. The Sixth Amendment guarantees a jury pulled from the state and district where the crime occurred, but absolutely nobody lives in this empty stretch. A law professor named Brian Colt discovered the gap and begged Congress to close it. They mostly ignored him, leaving the loophole sitting wide open today. 2. Back in colonial times, a sloppy Massachusetts survey crew accidentally grabbed a fat chunk of Connecticut soil and pretended it was theirs. When Connecticut finally noticed the theft and demanded its dirt back, Massachusetts basically shrugged and refused. Then they got greedy and sold the stolen land to investors, pocketing the cash. That awkward money helped bankroll the founding of Yale University, so one of America's fanciest schools was partly built on confidently stolen real estate. 3. Alaska is so enormous that it accidentally became the easternmost state in America, which sounds completely insane. Its Aleutian Islands stretch so far west that they cross the 180-degree meridian and spill straight into the eastern hemisphere. That technicality means Alaska holds the northernmost, westernmost, and somehow the easternmost points in the entire country all at once. Mapmakers basically threw up their hands. One frozen state quietly hoarding 3 directional titles feels deeply unfair to the other 49. 4. The tiny mining town of Rough and Ready got so furious about a federal mining tax in 1850 that it dramatically seceded from the United States entirely. The miners declared their own little republic and felt very proud of themselves for about 3 months. Then the 4th of July rolled around, and they realized nobody would legally sell booze to a foreign nation. So they quietly rejoined America just in time to celebrate the country they had abandoned. 5. One night in 1877, the Missouri River got bored and carved itself a brand new path while everyone slept. By morning, the entire town of Carter Lake, Iowa, had been yanked to the wrong side of the water. Suddenly, this loyal Iowa community was physically stranded inside Nebraska, completely surrounded by a state it never agreed to join. The residents woke up geographically kidnapped by a river. To this day, Carter Lake remains the confused little Iowa orphan, trapped in Nebraska. 6. Point Roberts, Washington, is a tiny American peninsula accidentally dangling beneath Canada like a forgotten sock. The border was drawn along a straight line that sliced this nub off from the rest of the country. Local children cannot even reach their own American schools without leaving the United States. Every single school day, these kids cross the international border 4 separate times just to get an education. Imagine showing your passport twice before lunch and twice more before homework. 7. The town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, has been quietly burning underground since 1962, and nobody can stop it. A garbage fire crept into an abandoned coal mine and ignited a vein that keeps feeding the flames decade after decade. The roads buckle and crack open, while toxic smoke seeps up through people's yards. The state eventually gave up, condemned everything, and basically erased the town from existence. A handful of stubborn residents still live there above a fire, entering its 7th decade. 8. A violent earthquake in 1812 ripped a tiny peninsula of Kentucky loose and stranded it entirely inside Tennessee and the Mississippi River. This forgotten nub became the perfect hideout because neither state wanted to bother enforcing the law out there. Outlaws and feuding families realized they could do basically whatever they pleased. For years, it operated as a lawless little pocket where justice simply never arrived. The Kentucky Bend became a violent loophole carved by an earthquake nobody invited. 9. The surveyors mapping Delaware's southern border in colonial times were reportedly so wildly drunk that the boundary line wanders like a stumbling man. Instead of a clean straight cut, the line lurches and zigzags in confused directions across the landscape. In some spots, it staggers right through people's kitchens and living rooms, splitting homes between jurisdictions. Centuries later, families still live with a border that clearly belongs to whichever surveyor needed to sit down. Drunk geometry permanently carved into the map. 10. Here is a fact that breaks the average American brain instantly. A rocky cliff sitting in Maine is actually hundreds of miles closer to Morocco in Africa than Miami, Florida is. The Earth's dramatic curve scrunches the northern coast far closer to the other continent than anyone expects. People assume Florida hangs nearest to everything overseas, but chilly Maine quietly wins the contest. So a lighthouse keeper in Maine waving east is greeting Africa long before Miami ever could. 11. In 1850, a religious leader named James Strang sailed to a Michigan island and decided he should literally be a king. He crowned himself with an actual crown, robes and all, and ruled Beaver Island as a genuine monarchy inside the United States. His little kingdom collected taxes, made laws, and answered to nobody but King James himself. The federal government basically watched this absurdity unfold for years. The whole sovereign nation collapsed only when two angry followers assassinated their king. 12. When New Hampshire and Canada could not agree who owned a scrap of borderland, the roughly 300 residents living there got completely fed up. So in 1832, they did the most American thing imaginable and founded their own country. The Republic of Indian Stream wrote its own constitution, ran its own affairs, and even threatened to fight both nations at once. These farmers genuinely declared themselves a sovereign power over a patch of woods. Eventually, everyone calmed down and they rejoined New Hampshire. 13. Prepare for a naming disaster that makes no logical sense whatsoever. The westernmost tip of plain old Virginia actually pokes further west than any point in the entire state of West Virginia. The state, literally named for being the western part, somehow loses the contest to its eastern parent. Geography teachers everywhere quietly weep when students discover this. So West Virginia carries a directional name it cannot even back up, beaten at its own job by regular Virginia. 14. The Ohio River decided one day to wander off and quietly stranded a slice of Kentucky on the wrong side of the water. That orphaned chunk now sits awkwardly attached to Indiana instead. The strangest victim is Ellis Park, a Kentucky horse racetrack that you literally cannot reach without first driving through Indiana. So gamblers technically leave one state, enter another, and bet on races in a third. The horses do not care, but the map makers definitely lost sleep. 15. For 40 long years, the Oklahoma Panhandle belonged to absolutely nobody, which sounds completely made up. This thin strip floated between territories with no state, no courts, no police, and no rules whatsoever. Settlers nicknamed it No Man's Land because anyone could do anything and face zero consequences. Outlaws, squatters, and dreamers flocked to this lawless rectangle of pure chaos. It became a genuine legal black hole where the concept of authority simply did not exist for decades. 16. A single bad map accidentally trapped a chunk of Minnesota inside Canada, and it has stayed stuck there ever since. The negotiators drawing the border relied on a wildly inaccurate map and confidently drew the line in the wrong spot. The result is the northwest angle, the only place in the lower 48 that sits north of the famous 49th parallel. Residents there must pass through Canada to reach the rest of their own state. Cartographer's mistake, permanent address. 17. In 1816, the people of New York watched snowfall in the middle of July and assumed the world was ending. The real culprit was a massive volcanic eruption clear across the planet in Indonesia that choked the sky with ash. Crops froze, livestock starved, and farmers stared helplessly at frosted summer fields. They called it the year without a summer because the seasons completely abandoned them. An exploding mountain on the other side of Earth ruined New York's entire harvest. 18. Key West got so annoyed by a federal border roadblock in 1982 that it declared itself the Conch Republic and seceded from the United States. To launch their rebellion, they cheerfully declared war by whacking a U.S. Navy officer with a loaf of stale Cuban bread. 1 minute after declaring war, they immediately surrendered. Then, with perfect comedic timing, they demanded $1 billion in foreign aid for the damage. It remains the most gloriously ridiculous secession in American history. 19. Thanks to 2 colonial land grants that flat-out contradicted each other, a 1 square mile triangle of Delaware ended up claimed by absolutely no state. This little wedge fell through the legal cracks completely, belonging to nobody at all. The lucky residents living inside it paid 0 taxes to anyone for well over a century. No state could collect because no state could prove ownership. People genuinely lived tax-free for generations simply because 2 old maps refused to agree. 20. Nebraska holds a lonely title that perfectly captures its landlocked misery. It is the only triply landlocked state in the entire country, meaning you must cross at least 3 borders in any direction just to glimpse an ocean. The poor Nebraskan dreaming of waves faces a brutal road trip through multiple states before tasting salt air. No shortcut exists, no matter which way you point the car. Geography essentially sentenced the whole state to a very long drive for sand. 21. The town of Kaskaskia once proudly served as the very first capital of Illinois, sitting comfortably on the east side of the Mississippi. Then, in 1881, the river threw a violent flooding tantrum and carved a brand new channel right through the land. When the water settled, the historic town had been shoved entirely to the west bank. Now this little piece of Illinois can only be reached by driving through Missouri. The river basically evicted an entire state capital overnight. 22. Ohio and Michigan nearly went to actual war in 1835 over a sliver of land barely 8 miles wide. A poorly mapped river mouth left both sides convinced the valuable Toledo Strip belonged to them. Both governments hastily raised armed civilian militias and marched them toward the disputed border, fists clenched. The whole standoff produced lots of shouting, 1 minor stabbing, and 0 real battles. Eventually, Michigan surrendered Toledo but got handed the entire Upper Peninsula as a consolation prize. 23. There exists a tiny, completely empty Cape of America that pokes stubbornly down into Canada and refuses to be useful. Elm Point belongs to Minnesota, yet no road on American soil connects to it whatsoever. To legally reach this little nub, you must either arrive by boat or hike straight through the Canadian wilderness. Nobody lives there, nobody visits, and nobody really wants it. America simply owns a patch of grass that Canada physically surrounds and quietly babysits. 24. In 1811, a monstrous earthquake along the New Madrid Fault shook Missouri so violently that it broke the laws of common sense. The ground heaved, the land buckled, and for several astonishing hours the mighty Mississippi River actually flowed backward. Witnesses watched the powerful current reverse direction like a confused garden hose. Boats spun, the riverbed rose, and entire stretches of water churned upstream. The most powerful river in the region briefly forgot which way it was supposed to go. 25. Long before Tennessee fully existed, a chunk of its eastern mountains got tired of waiting around and declared itself a brand new state in 1784. They proudly named it Franklin, printed their own money, and ran their own little government with total confidence. For 4 whole years, this rogue state survived on stubbornness and homemade currency. Congress never officially recognized it, and the dream slowly fell apart. Eventually broke and exhausted, Franklin quietly dissolved back into the union it left. 26. In a spectacular display of confidence, American engineers spent enormous money building a massive stone fortress to guard the Canadian border. There was just one tiny problem nobody caught until later. Thanks to a botched survey, they had constructed the entire fort inside actual Canadian territory by mistake. Locals lovingly nicknamed the wasted structure Fort Blunder. America had built a mighty defensive fortress to protect itself from Canada, accidentally located in Canada. The line was eventually moved to fix it. 27. Here is a geography trick that ruins road trip arguments instantly. The inland Nevada city of Reno actually sits further west than coastal Los Angeles, which feels physically impossible. The entire west coast tilts dramatically eastward as it slides south, dragging California's shoreline well inland. So a tourist standing on a beach in LA is somehow east of a casino in landlocked Reno. People refuse to believe it until they stare at a map and slowly lose their minds. 28. The Rio Grande spent over a century behaving like the messiest neighbor imaginable along the Texas and Mexico border. The river kept wandering back and forth, dragging chunks of land into different countries depending on its mood. One entire neighborhood near El Paso kept waking up in a different nation as the water shifted. Families genuinely lost track of which country they lived in. It took a formal international treaty just to finally make the confused river sit still. 29. A messy border argument between Spain and the United States created a strip of Louisiana where the law simply ceased to exist. Both sides agreed to leave the disputed zone alone, banning any military from setting foot inside. The result was the neutral strip, a lawless no-entry buffer that quickly filled with bandits and runaways. With no authority allowed to enter, outlaws treated it like a personal paradise. For years, it became the most dangerous unofficial hideout in the region. 30. The American border guards drew a line so straight that it sliced one living community cleanly into two countries. On the United States side sits Calexico, California, and directly across the fence sits Mexicali, Mexico. The names are practically just California and Mexico smashed together and swapped around. People shop, work, and visit family by simply crossing from one half of the town to the other. It is essentially one neighborhood wearing two different national costumes split down the middle. 31. In Wyoming, there is a river that genuinely tries to cook you alive, which sounds like a terrible theme park ride. Deep underground, a geothermal anomaly pumps scalding boiling water straight into an otherwise freezing cold stream. Where the two collide, you get a beautiful spot that will literally poach a swimmer like an egg. Tourists naturally see steaming water in nature and think it looks inviting. Park rangers spend their days frantically explaining that this gorgeous river is basically a soup pot. 32. When Alabama dramatically seceded from the Union in 1861, one stubborn county decided two could play that game. Winston County looked at the Confederacy, shrugged, and proudly seceded right back, declaring loyalty to the United States. Locals nicknamed it the Free State of Winston and refused to fight for the rebel cause. The rest of Alabama was furious, but these mountain farmers simply did not care. A county seceding from a state that just seceded is peak American stubbornness. 33. Bad colonial mapmaking left behind a strange little orphan of land in Vermont that belonged to absolutely no town. This awkward 5,000-acre leftover, called a gore, fell between the cracks of every official boundary. Because no town or county claimed it, nobody could legally collect taxes there either. The lucky residents enjoyed an accidental tax haven created purely by sloppy surveyors. For decades, this forgotten patch of Vermont existed as a tiny ungoverned pocket nobody bothered to fix. 34. People love bragging about California's massive coastline, so this fact tends to start arguments at parties. Maine, despite looking tiny on a map, actually has more tidal shoreline than the entire state of California. The secret lies in Maine's thousands of jagged bays, rocky inlets, and scattered islands that wrinkle the coast endlessly. All those twists and turns add up to staggering mileage. So humble little Maine quietly out coastlines the mighty Pacific giant, much to California's annoyance. 35. In 1931, Oklahoma and Texas nearly started shooting at each other over an argument about a bridge. A shifting river border sparked a feud about who controlled the crossing and who could collect the tolls. Oklahoma's governor got so heated, he deployed armed National Guardsmen to seize the bridge by force. Texas pushed back, traffic halted, and interstate travel completely shut down during the standoff. Grown men with rifles guarding a bridge over a fight nobody fully understood anymore. 36. The Supreme Court once had to settle a genuinely petty argument over who owned Ellis Island. The justices ruled that the small original natural island truly belongs to New York. However, all the extra land, later created by dumping in dirt and rubble, belongs entirely to New Jersey. So the famous immigration gateway is awkwardly split between two states based on which parts were real ground and which parts were filler. The nation's front door technically has two landlords. 37. Long ago, Connecticut decided that controlling Connecticut was simply not enough land for its taste. The state officially claimed a giant 120-mile strip, stretching all the way into modern-day Ohio. They called this distant colony the Western Reserve, and genuinely governed a chunk of land inside another future state. Settlers from Connecticut packed up and moved hundreds of miles to live in this bizarre detached extension. Eventually, Connecticut let go, but the strange claim left lasting marks. 38. Maine is famous for being lush, green, rainy, and absolutely covered in forests, which makes this completely absurd. Tucked inside all that greenery sits a literal 40-acre desert of rolling sand dunes. A prehistoric glacier dumped the sand long ago, and centuries later, reckless farming stripped the topsoil and let the dunes swallow everything. Today, tourists pay money to stand in a tiny Sahara surrounded by pine trees. A desert in soggy Maine feels like nature making a typo. 39. In 1799, a bold British adventurer named William Augustus Bowles pulled off something genuinely audacious in Florida. He united several indigenous tribes and declared the fully sovereign state of Muskogee, complete with its own navy and flag. This brand new nation openly defied the United States and Spain, raiding their interests and refusing to back down. For several years, Bowles actually managed to keep his improvised country alive. His ambitious little nation eventually fell only after he was captured and imprisoned. 40. The border between Colorado and New Mexico was supposed to be a perfectly clean straight line, simple as a ruler. Unfortunately, the surveyor's compass kept glitching out as he worked his way across the rugged terrain. Instead of one crisp boundary, he left behind a permanent jagged zigzag dent, stamped into the map forever. Nobody ever bothered fixing the embarrassing wobble, so it remains there today. Two states divided by a line that clearly could not walk in a straight direction. 41. People assume an inland southern city sits closest to places like Chicago, but the map plays a sneaky trick. Atlanta, Georgia, is actually deceptively close to the tropical Bahamas, thanks to the deep eastward scoop of the American Southeast. The coastline curves inward so dramatically that Caribbean islands end up nearer than many northern cities. So, a businessman in Atlanta is practically a tropical neighbor without realizing it. The South quietly leans toward palm trees while everyone assumes it faces the Midwest. 42. Lake Michigan has no business producing tidal waves, yet it occasionally launches massive destructive walls of water anyway. The culprit is a bizarre weather phenomenon called a meteotsunami, triggered by sudden atmospheric pressure changes rather than any earthquake. A fast-moving storm shoves the water into a surging wave that slams the shore without warning. Beachgoers have been swept away by these sneaky surges on otherwise calm days. A freshwater lake throwing ocean-style tsunamis genuinely shocks every scientist who studies it. 43. Everyone calls the Statue of Liberty a proud symbol of New York, but the surrounding water tells a sneakier story. The justices long ago decided that the waters hugging Liberty Island actually belong completely to New Jersey. Yet the island itself remains a legal exclave of New York, marooned inside Jersey territory. So Lady Liberty stands on New York soil, while floating in New Jersey water. The most famous American landmark is essentially caught in a quiet two-state custody battle. 44. Hyder is the most cut-off little corner of Alaska, and it barely behaves like Alaska at all. No road connects it to the rest of the state, leaving it stranded against the Canadian border. The residents quietly gave up and adopted Canadian money, a Canadian area code, and even Canadian police for emergencies. America technically owns the place, but Canada basically runs the day-to-day life. Hyder is an Alaskan town cosplaying as a Canadian village. 45. The entire Salton Sea, a massive inland body of water in California, exists purely because of a colossal engineering screw-up. Around 1905, workers diverting the Colorado River lost control, and the whole river came roaring into a dry desert basin. For nearly 2 years, the water poured in unchecked, accidentally filling an enormous lake nobody planned. At first, it became a glamorous resort destination. Then it slowly turned toxic and started killing fish, leaving behind a stinking accidental sea. 46. Along the remote Maine border, French-American settlers grew tired of being claimed by two different countries pulling at them. So they decided neither nation truly deserved them and created their own little homeland instead. They called it the Republic of Madawaska, complete with its own proud flag and fierce local identity. Although it was never officially recognized as a real country, the spirit never died. Locals still fly that defiant Madawaska flag today as a cheerful middle finger to borders. 47. Texas was once so absurdly enormous that its territory stretched all the way up into modern-day Wyoming. The state genuinely had a long finger of land poking far north of where anyone expects Texas to end. Eventually, federal law forced Texas to chop off that distant northern tip to comply with rules about slavery in new territories, so Texas literally sold away a piece of itself to settle a national argument. The Lone Star State used to be even more ridiculous. 48. Deep in Washington's Columbia River Basin, massive open-pit mining operations carved an engineered hole of staggering depth. The relentless digging cut so far below the surrounding land that it created one of the lowest accessible points of solid ground in the region. Standing at the bottom means standing far beneath the level of distant seawater. The sheer scale of the man-made pit dwarfs everything around it. Humans essentially dug their way toward the center of the earth for profit. 49. The city of Chicago had a disgusting problem, since all its sewage flowed straight into the lake it drank from. So, in a moment of pure engineering audacity, the city decided to simply reverse an entire river. Using a system of giant locks and canals, engineers forced the Chicago River to flow backward, away from Lake Michigan. The waste now drifted toward the Mississippi instead, becoming somebody else's problem. They literally bullied a river into running the opposite direction forever. 50. There is a charming old library on the Vermont and Canada border that was built directly on the line on purpose. The Haskell Library was designed so the front entrance and reading room sit in Vermont, while the book checkout desk sits in Quebec. A thick black line on the floor marks exactly where one country ends and the other begins. Visitors regularly stand in two nations at once while browsing novels. It is the only library where reading requires international travel. 51. Tucked inside Oklahoma sits a geographic oddity that makes county maps look like a mistake. A chunk of land belonging entirely to one county floats completely detached, marooned deep inside a totally different neighboring county. It is an island of jurisdiction with no physical connection to its actual home. To reach your own county, you must first travel through somebody else's. Local officials basically have to leapfrog over a rival county just to govern their own stranded little patch of dirt. 52. Florida has a swampy little zone near Lake Okeechobee that gets blasted by more lightning than almost anywhere on Earth. The unique soggy topography cooks up perfect storm conditions that summon cloud to ground strikes constantly. Locals essentially live inside a natural lightning factory that never stops manufacturing electricity. Cattle, golfers, and unlucky tourists have all learned to respect the sky here. Scientists nicknamed the region Lightning Alley because the heavens treat it like a personal dartboard every single afternoon. 53. In 1853, a brash American captain named William Walker pulled off one of the cockiest stunts imaginable. He gathered a small private army in California and simply invaded Mexico without permission from anyone. Walker boldly declared himself president of a brand new Republic of Sonora, then demanded the United States annex his conquest. America refused, his supplies ran dry, and his fantasy empire collapsed almost instantly. Walker basically tried to gift his country a nation that nobody actually wanted. 54. A sloppy survey along the Vermont and Canada border managed to slice an entire town clean in half. The community of Darby got carved by the boundary line, stranding some American houses on the Canadian side. Families ended up living in homes where the country technically changed depending on which room they stood in. Crossing the kitchen could mean crossing a border. The poor residents simply learned to live with a line that ran straight through their everyday lives. 55. Here is a direction trick that breaks every American's mental compass instantly. If you stand in downtown Detroit and drive due south, you do not stay in the United States like you would expect. Instead, you cross straight into Windsor, Canada, because the Detroit River hooks in a bizarre curve. So Canada actually sits south of part of Michigan, flipping everyone's assumptions upside down. Detroiters genuinely confuse tourists by pointing south and calling it the way to Canada. 56. Out in the Chesapeake Bay sits a tiny Virginia island slowly being erased from existence. Tangier Island is losing as much as 30 feet of land every single year to relentless erosion. Backyards that families once mowed are now open ocean, and the water keeps creeping closer to front doors. The shrinking community watches helplessly as their home literally dissolves beneath them. Experts warn that this stubborn little fishing island may completely vanish into the bay within a few generations. 57. A bizarre tangle of old maritime deeds left a tiny New Jersey pier stranded in the strangest possible situation. The little structure at Finn's Point technically belongs to New Jersey, yet it sits completely surrounded by the dry land and sovereign border of Delaware. So a sliver of Jersey property pokes awkwardly into territory that is otherwise entirely Delaware. Centuries-old paperwork created this confusing pocket nobody bothered to untangle. One state owns a pier marooned inside the body of another. 58. Far out in the Pacific Ocean sits a tiny atoll that one American family privately owned for generations. Swains Island was essentially the personal property of the Jennings family, who ran it like their own little kingdom for decades. Eventually, the United States government quietly folded the speck of land into American Samoa. The family's private island simply became part of a U.S. territory, almost without anyone noticing. America basically absorbed a household's personal paradise into the official map. 59. In 1980, an oil drilling crew on Lake Peigneur in Louisiana made one of the most catastrophic mistakes imaginable. Their drill missed its mark and punched straight into a massive salt mine hidden beneath the lake. Instantly, the water began draining into the mine, spawning a monstrous whirlpool that devoured everything. The swirling vortex swallowed the entire drilling rig plus 11 barges like bath toys. The lake literally pulled itself down a drain and reversed a waterfall in the chaos. 60. During the Civil War, a defiant Mississippi farmer named Newton Knight decided he wanted nothing to do with the Confederacy. He gathered fellow rebels, deserters, and runaways, then launched an armed uprising against the rebel government itself. Knight successfully carved out his own pro-Union pocket nicknamed the Free State of Jones. For a time, his ragtag fighters genuinely controlled the region and defied Confederate authority. One stubborn farmer essentially seceded from the secession in the heart of the Deep South. 61. West Virginia has a northern panhandle so absurdly skinny, it looks like the state got pinched in a door. At its narrowest squeeze, the entire state measures only about 4 miles wide, wedged tightly between Ohio and Pennsylvania. A person could practically eat breakfast in one neighboring state and lunch in the other after barely crossing West Virginia. The thin little sliver seems one good stretch away from snapping clean off. Geography essentially squeezed the state into a fragile ribbon up there. 62. Montana proudly claims one of the most laughably tiny rivers anyone has ever seen. The Roe River flows for a grand total of just 201 feet before it abruptly empties out and quits. That is shorter than a single football field, yet locals genuinely call it a river with a straight face. For a while, it even held a record as the world's shortest, sparking a friendly feud with another tiny stream. Calling that trickle a river is delightfully ridiculous. 63. In 1969, the United States Army engineers did something that sounds completely impossible. They simply turned off the American side of Niagara Falls. Using a temporary dam, they diverted the entire flow so the famous waterfall went bone dry for several months. Crowds gathered to stare at the bare rock and exposed riverbed normally hidden beneath thundering water. The engineers wanted to study erosion and clear loose rubble. For a strange stretch of time, one of nature's giants was politely paused. 64. There is a park sitting directly on the California and Mexico border where heartbreak and joy happen through a fence. Friendship Park lets people from 2 different countries gather on opposite sides of a thick metal mesh barrier. Families separated by immigration laws come here just to glimpse loved ones and press their fingers together. At most, people can legally touch pinky fingers through the tiny gaps in the mesh. An entire reunion sometimes happens through nothing more than a fingertip. 65. Way out in the vast Pacific sits a lonely speck of land first claimed by an American telegraph company. Wake Island was little more than a remote atoll thousands of miles from the mainland, useful mainly for stringing communication lines. Over time, the United States military recognized its strategic value and turned it into an official outpost. This tiny dot of coral became a genuine American base in the middle of nowhere. A telegraph company essentially handed the country a faraway island. 66. In certain Alaskan lakes, you can literally set the frozen surface on fire, which sounds like a campfire prank gone wrong. Beneath the winter ice, decaying plants release highly flammable methane gas that gets trapped in stunning bubbles. When someone pokes a hole and brings a flame close, the escaping gas erupts into a blazing fireball. Scientists study these eerie methane pockets while thrill seekers light them up for fun. A lake that ignites with a single match feels deeply unnatural. 67. When the Confederacy came calling in 1861, one Tennessee county flatly refused to play along. Scott County voted to secede from the state entirely, rejecting the rebel cause and declaring itself an independent little republic. The county basically thumbed its nose at Tennessee and went its own stubborn way. The wildest part is the timing of the reunion. Scott County did not officially rejoin the state of Tennessee until 1986, more than a century after their dramatic protest. 68. A simple arithmetic mistake by a 19th century mapmaker left a permanent scar on the Texas border. While drawing the eastern boundary of New Mexico, the surveyor's bad math produced a jagged, staircase-like pattern instead of a clean line. The result is an unexplainable zigzag wobble that climbs awkwardly across the map forever. Nobody ever corrected the embarrassing stumble, so it remains stamped there today. Texas essentially has a crooked corner because someone could not do their numbers right. 69. There is exactly one spot in the entire country where a person can stand in 4 different states at once. The Four Corners Quadrupoint is where Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah all meet at a single precise intersection. Tourists love sprawling across the marker, planting one limb in each state for the ultimate photo. It is the only place in America where you can be in 4 places simultaneously without moving an inch. Geography basically created a human pretzel zone. 70. New Hampshire is home to a river that performs the strangest disappearing act in nature. The aptly named Lost River tumbles down a mountainside and then simply vanishes into the earth without warning. It dives into a chaotic underground labyrinth of giant tumbled boulders and hidden caves, weaving invisibly through the rock. Hikers can follow the water until it dramatically ducks out of sight. The river basically plays an endless game of hide-and-seek with everyone who visits. 71. In the quiet border town of Calais, Maine, there sits a courthouse with a genuinely hilarious flaw. The building stands so absurdly close to the Canadian boundary that the line practically brushes the windows. According to local legend, a clever criminal inside could theoretically leap straight out a window and instantly land beyond United States jurisdiction. One good jump, and the law could not touch them. It remains the most tempting escape route ever accidentally built into a government building. And there you have it. 71 of the dumbest geographical anomalies that prove America's map was basically drawn by confused, exhausted, and occasionally drunk people. But now we want to hear from you. Which one absolutely broke your brain the most? Was it the town trapped inside Canada, the river that ran backward, or the courthouse you could jump out of to escape the law? Drop your answer in the comments because we read every single one. If this video made you question everything you thought you knew, smash that like button and subscribe to Dumbest Things for more insane stories. We will see you in the next one.